Amen. The brother of the founder of the Methodist movement, well, you know his name is the founder of the Methodist movement is none other from the 1700s, John Wesley. Many people know in Christendom that name, but very few know his brother, Charles Wesley. And of course, they know about their famous mother, Susanna Wesley, great woman of God and faith who raised incredible children in the Lord. But Charles Wesley, well, he wasn't gifted and wired like his brother John Wesley. He wasn't really a preacher per se or a founder of a movement of churches, but he was all gifted in songwriting and music. And Charles Wesley, he captured the experience in his beautiful Christmas hymn called, well, here's what he said in that hymn. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. Pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. So the joy of meeting Jesus and worshiping him. That was the essence of the hymn. The joy of meeting Jesus for the first time and then worshiping him as a result of meeting Jesus for the first time. And so we continue on this morning in the Christmas story, if you will. But like we learned last week and the weeks before, it's not typically, well, the same with tradition, right? Sometimes tradition messes up or skews our perceptions of the accurate biblical picture. So as we continue on, we're going to pick it up in verse 7. It's Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2. Let's look at verses 7 through 12. That's what we're going to study this morning. We're just going to read the whole text. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. Verse 8. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. So, what's going on? Let's unpack this a little bit. Verse 7. Herod secretly calls the wise men. And what did we learn last Sunday morning? We learned that there are 3 different ways that people typically respond to Jesus. One, they could be like these magi, these wise men, these non-Jews, these Gentiles, where they are seeking Jesus. Why? Well, to worship him, to present gifts to him. Or, number 2, people could be like King Herod, hostility towards the king, opposition towards the king. Or we could be like the chief priests and the scribes, indifferent and ignoring the king. So one category, magi, seek the king, worship the king, bring gifts to the king. Second category and class of people in the world, King Herod, opposing the king, hostile toward the king, enemy of the king. Or third category and class, chief priests and scribes. We know the Bible. We study the scriptures. We went to seminary. We went to Bible college. We can quote to you Bible verses, chapter and verse, left and right. Bethlehem is only 5-6 miles from Jerusalem. But we're indifferent to the king. We're ignoring the king. And that's typically the response. But now as we pick it up in our text this morning, Herod now is being deceitful and pretending that he wants to, worship the king as well. And then we see in verse 8, he says, yeah, young child. Now, that's typically what messes up the Christmas scene. Let's get some participation. How many of you guys have seen a nativity scene like set up in person? Okay. Describe to me what you see when you look at the Christmas story, the picture. What is typically what you see?
Baby and the kings around it.
Okay, you see a baby and kings surrounding that baby. What else do you observe in the traditional Christmas nativity scene?
An angel.
Okay, an angel.
Yeah. A star.
Angel, a star, baby, kings surrounding it. Now, typically, how many kings or wise men do you see? Three. Okay, so that's usually what you see in this scene. Well, right away we have, I don't know if you heard that show, Mythbusters. So let's do a little Mythbusters this morning. Okay, one myth. It wasn't a baby. At this point in time, mathematically, notice in verse 8, you might want to take a pencil or pen if it's handy. Underline and circle in verse 8, it says young, capital C letter word, child. Child, it's not a baby. Jesus here, according to Bible scholars, theologians, and Bible commentators, he's about 1.5 to 2 years old at this point. He's about 18 months. He's probably walking around and talking at this point. He's 18 months to 2 years old. So by the time the Magi get there, Jesus is already a child. Here's Mythbuster number 2. He's not in a manger anymore. Okay, they're where?
In a house.
They're in a house, as Wendy said. They're already in their own home in Bethlehem. Yes, it's still Bethlehem. That's where Jesus was born. And then we're going to see later on he's going to grow up in Nazareth, right? That's going to be where he's raised and reared. But his origins are in Bethlehem. So Mythbuster number 1, he is not a baby anymore. He's a young child by the time the Magi come to him to worship and present gifts to him. Number 2 myth, buster, is he's not in a manger, in a stable anymore with a bunch of animals. He's in his own home. He's in his own house. But we're also going to go, well, look at it says in verse 10. It says, when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. The star. This could be kind of Mythbuster. Now, conjecture is, there's so many conjectures, so many opinions of people. Some people believe it's Jupiter, the largest planet there in the solar system. Some believe it's Jupiter and Saturn in conjunction with each other. Others have suggested, number 3, that it's a flyby runaway comet. Or number 4, it's a meteor. Now, these are all, again, opinions, all conjectures. What does the Bible just say it is? It's a star, okay? Now, some say, well, Eric, a star can't do that. A star won't just stay in place. Well, it's definitely not a comet or a meteor because they just keep going. They don't stop. And a star, they say, well, it doesn't just stay put. Well, again, if this is of the Lord, right, then God can do anything. And so it's a star that he has specially provided and prepared for this purpose, right? So he's prepared for the purpose and the plan that he has. Nothing is too hard for God. Nothing's impossible for God. If he has commanded a star to then move and stay in place, well, again, that is nothing too hard for him. Nothing's too difficult for him. He's the creator. He's in charge over creation. Stars are a part of his creation. If he wants to command a star to stay put, it's going to stay put. Okay? So people kind of make it complicated. Oh, maybe it's a comet. Maybe it's a meteor. Maybe it's Jupiter. Maybe it's Saturn and Jupiter. Again, it's maybe. Let's just read the Bible. The Bible says it's a star. It's a star. Okay? We don't have to add or take away from it. But how about Mythbuster number 4? Well, before we get to Mythbuster number 4, I want to camp out a little bit on, look again at verse 11. It says, and when they, speaking of the wise men, had come into the house, that's what Wendy had pointed out. It's not a manger anymore. They're not in stables anymore. Into the house, They saw the young child, emphasis again. Child, in fact, is in verse 8. Young child is brought up again in verse 9. And then it's brought up again in verse 11. I think Matthew wants to make a point there. They saw the young child while with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped her. No, it doesn't say that. And they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped the star. No, they worshipped him. That's why today's message is called Worship Him. That's what inspired the title of today. They came and they fell down, and Matthew is careful to jot that down and note it. He fell down and worshipped him. Not Mary, not Joseph, not the star, even though they were stargazers themselves. Remember, we learned that a few weeks ago. These guys studied the stars. They were into astrology and astronomy and a lot of weird stuff, but they didn't worship the star either. Even though it was quite a sight, it was quite supernatural, it was quite divine, right? They worship him. Now, Matthew is careful to say that they worshiped him and not Mary, but I want to show you 3 instances in the Bible. There's a lot more. I'm going to give you 3 from the New Testament, if you're taking note this morning, where people were inclined and tempted to worship the messenger or the instrument or the servant or the man of God or the vessel that God used instead of actually God himself. You see, we are created by God to worship. We are created by God to worship. We just are. That's the way we're wired. That's our makeup. And unfortunately, we are tempted in our flesh, egged on by Satan and his demons, to worship everything and anything else under the sun but the Son, Jesus Christ. That's not a coincidence, by the way. That's not an accident. In fact, it's not in my notes, but I feel inclined to say this morning. You remember the 10 Commandments, not the 10 suggestions, right? The 10 Commandments. God's moral law. What's at the it's his top 10, by the way. There's 613 laws in the Old Testament, but these are the top 10. You can't miss them. It's the big E on the eye chart. Okay? What's the first commandment out of the top 10 in God's moral law in Exodus chapter 20? You shall have no other gods before me. Lowercase g. No other gods. Now, when you look at the original Hebrew language, here's a little bonus for you this morning's Bible study. It literally means no other gods before me, above me, or with me. That's what it means in the original Hebrew. It's pretty deep. God says, I so want your worship. I'm a jealous God. I so want your worship. I don't want any other gods before me, above me, or even with me. I'm not going to share that. Okay, because not that God is such on an ego trip, but he is God. He is the one and only. There is nothing and no one else in the whole universe that can compare to him. Okay, he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the great I am, the eternal one, the Prince of Peace, mighty God, everlasting Father. And can I go on? I mean, let's get Pentecostal this morning. I mean, you could continue to, you're like, yeah, this is the Lord. He is chief. He is king. He is God. He is in that place of worship. So he says, no. Great commandment, no other gods before me. But let me give you 3 examples just in the New Testament alone, if you're taking note, where even people who were well-meaning, well-intentioned, made this mistake. Just like wanting to worship Mary rather than worship Jesus. I've asked you to go to Acts 10. In Acts chapter 10, number 1, if you're taking note, who made this mistake? It's a man named Cornelius. A man named Cornelius. Now, we're not going to read the whole chapter because it's like 48 verses. But just to give you a little bit of context, this is the early church. Acts is all about a documentation, a record of the first century church, the early Christians. And right now, by the way, let's get a little trivia here. I'm going to give you multiple choice, in fact. Let's do something fun. Multiple choice. Was Christianity founded and started geographically speaking in A, Rome, Italy, B, Jerusalem, Israel, C, Atlanta, Georgia, USA, D, Salt Lake City, Utah, E, Beijing, China, F, Tokyo, Japan. There's some points on why I wanted to say those specific places.
G, all of the above.
Or Peter added one, G, all the above. Where was Christianity founded? A, Rome, Italy. B, what did I say? Jerusalem, Israel. It's definitely not in my notes, you could tell. C, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, USA. And then Salt Lake City, Utah. Yeah, Savannah, Georgia, USA, or all the above. Where do you guys think Christianity finds its geographical origins? Jerusalem, Israel, the Middle East. Some people say, oh, of course you're Christian, you're American. It's like, it didn't start in America. It's from the Middle East, actually. It didn't come from even Europe. Oh, well, it's European, right? The white men's religion. It's actually the Middle Eastern religion. It came from Jerusalem, Israel. That's where the church started. That's where Christianity began as we know it. But by the time we get to Acts chapter 10, it's still kind of a very Jewish sect, if you will. It's a Jewish thing. But now the Holy Spirit's going to pour out on who? The non-Jews, the Gentiles. And so we go to Acts chapter 10, and look what it says in verse 1. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. Now look at verse 2. It's not just some dopey guy in a bar or some guy on the street who doesn't know what he's talking about. Look at verse 2. A devout man and one who feared God with all his household. He's a good dad. He's a good husband. He's influenced his household for Jesus. Who gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. So he's a man of prayer. He's a family man. He's a generous and giving man. He's a devout man. He's a God-fearing man. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 qualities that are pretty awesome about this guy. And number 6, he's a man in leadership. So he's a leader. So he's not a dopey, stupid, ignorant guy. And yet, God gives him a vision. And then God gives the Apostle Peter a vision, right? And what does Cornelius do? He makes a grave mistake. He makes a mistake. Even though he's got these 6 qualities, leader, devout, God-fearing, family man, generous man, praying man, and yet what happens? Look at verse 25 and 26. Acts 10, 25 and 26. Peter comes, and as Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down. There's that same language we saw in Matthew 2. And fell down at his feet and worshiped him. Cornelius, what are you doing? And Peter then says, kiss the ring. No, it doesn't say that either. Just making sure you guys are up this morning. I know it's a little colder right now. I want to make sure you're paying attention this morning. You're awake. And then Peter said, I'm the first pope. No. Peter said, build a monument and statue to me. No. What did Peter say? But Peter lifted him up, grabs him, lifted him up, saying, stand up. I myself am also a man. That's it. I'm a man. Don't worship me. What are you doing, Cornelius? What are you doing, man? I'm just a fellow servant. In fact, when I was a missionary in Spain, we used to take the Bible college students to Rome. Was one of the trips we would go to. We'd go to Rome, Italy. You know, the Roman Catholic Church, like the epicenter, right? So we were in Spain. We were in Mallorca. We were only not even like a 2-hour or so flight away from Mallorca to Rome. And I went there 3 times in the 3 years I was with that Calvary Chapel Bible College Extension campus. And the last trip I led, and we used to also, one of the places we went, of course, to the Colosseum, Gladiator, and we went to the catacombs, and we went to Paul's prison where he was in prison and wrote 2 Timothy. That was my favorite place, by the way, where he wrote his last letter before he was martyred. We went to Paul's prison, and we would read it together as a group. And we went to a lot of cool places. Definitely lived off pizza, gelato, and calzones. That's all we can afford as poor students and missionaries. But it was great. Best pizza ever and best gelato. But we went to St. Peter's Basilica, where the Vatican's at, where the Pope sits on ex cathedra. Ex cathedra literally is translated from Latin. It means the chair. And whenever the Pope sits on the chair, quote unquote, or ex cathedra, whenever he sits down, anything that comes out of his mouth in matters of life and faith is like God speaking. That's what it means. It's like God is speaking through the Pope. So, but it's St. Peter's, St. Peter's Basilica. And I remember as we went there looking around at these big sites, and, we're looking at, of course, these amazing paintings. There was a huge statue of Peter, and all these foreigners, us included, because we're foreign, we're not Italian, but the pastor's wife was Italian, so she actually went to interpret for us. She was from Rome, Loretta. And I remember we're all these foreigners, all these tourists coming by, and there's a Peter, and all of a sudden we get to Peter, we're waiting in line, we get to Peter's statue, and people are literally crying and weeping and wailing and kissing Peter's feet, his toes. Now, you could tell people have been doing this for years and years and centuries, and because only that part of the statue was worn out. It was so worn out from all the tears and all the kisses. And I just thought, wow, if Peter was here right now, what would he think of this sight? He'd probably rip his clothes and go, what are you doing? Don't worship me. Don't kiss and weep over my feet. It's Jesus to worship. Because how do you know he would say that, Eric? Well, look at when he's alive. Cornelius is ready to fall down and worship, and he's like, no, stand up. I'm just a man. What are you doing? It's about Jesus. Worship him. It's not false humility. It's not, don't be modest. No, it's like, you're going to get us both in trouble here. I'm just a guy. God's going to strike me right. What happened with, do you remember what happened with Herod later on in the gospel? When he came out in his shiny array, remember? And someone in the crowd said, as soon as he opened his mouth to talk, some guy said, look, the voice of a God. And it says in that instant, an angel came and struck him with worms because he didn't give glory to God. You remember King Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament, Babylonian Empire, the most powerful empire in the world at the time. Remember, he had one of the 7 wonders of the world at that time was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in the book of Daniel. The Hanging Gardens. And it says one day, and I'm paraphrasing because we're not going to go there in Daniel, that King Nebuchadnezzar was just kind of strolling his palace one day, and he was looking at everything he had built. Look at my empire. Look how great I am. And what happened? He said in that hour he was struck with what? Insanity, basically. And for 7 seasons, his nails grew long and his hair grew long like feathers. Holy, that's not what happened to me. That's not why my hair is long, by the way. I'm sane, I promise. I'm sane, I promise. I'm not insane. At least I think I'm not. I have amnesia. At least I think I do. No. But his hair grows like feathers, and his fingers grow like talons on an eagle. And basically, he's grazing and eating like a beast of the field, the grass of the earth. And then he's restored to his right mind, and he gives what? Glory to God. Because he learned his lesson. Like, yes, King Nebuchadnezzar, you're just a man. So we see these warnings. Every time a man's puffed his chest out and think, because actually in the book of Proverbs, in the book of wisdom, it says there's 6 things that God hates. Right? God hates? Yeah. I thought God just loved. No, there's 6 things that God hates. One is abomination or disgusting to him. And what's on the top of the list? We're not going to, that's a whole other Bible study, but I'm just giving you guys some bonus material here. These are like the deleted scenes. What does it say in the top of the list that God hates? a proud look. God hates that. Some guys smugly just, just all that. And God's looking down going, you are just a man. So there's all these warnings in the Bible. So Peter knows better. He's like, no, don't worship me. Now, here's a second time that people try to worship, but this time the people being worshipped, who are trying to worship, they're not like Cornelius. They are kind of out there. So that's Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14. Let's look at just a few chapters later. This is now Paul and Barnabas on a missionary journey. And look what's happening in Acts 14. And look at, they're in Lystra. Let's pick it up in verse 8. And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. Okay, he's been this way from birth. This man heard Paul speaking. So Paul's preaching. Paul, observing him intently, Paul senses something during the preaching of the gospel. And seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, stand up, straight on your feet. And he leaped and walked. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Remember this, they're polytheists, they believe in Greek mythology. And Barnabas they called Zeus, who's king of the gods. And Paul, Hermes, because he was the chief speaker, because Hermes was like the messenger of the gods. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, verse 18, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes, there's thousands, from sacrificing to them. So they're not like, awesome, yeah, bring on the garlands, bring on the oxen. Yeah, look, this is really, really neat. No, they're so distressed. They're like, no, this is why we're here. This is why we're preaching the gospel to you. That's why we're telling you to repent. These idols, these gods that you worship, they're like over and over in the Old Testament, they can't see. They're blind, they're mute, they're deaf, they're dumb. They're made of wood, metal, and materials. They're just idols. These gods that you have to feed, these gods that you have to carry and pick up around and worship, they're not real gods. They're meaningless. And so they're distressed. And lastly, number 3, we're going to go back. Just like Cornelius, though, number 1 wasn't a dopey guy in some bar room or some bar stool. We're going to look at Revelation. Revelation chapter 22. So those are examples of men saying, don't worship me. I'm going to give you guys an example in the New Testament when an angel says, don't worship me either. Okay? Because angels are more impressive than us. Let's be honest. Angels are way more impressive than us. But even an angel says, don't do it. Don't do it. Look at John. How John responds. The Apostle John is the only one of the apostles who wasn't martyred. He grew to see old age into his 90s, and he writes the book of Revelation as he's been exiled to the island of Patmos. And what does it say in Revelation chapter 22? It's the very last chapter of the Bible, of the New Testament, of the book of Revelation. And look at Revelation 22, verses 8 and 9. Now I, John, saw and heard these things, a lot of things for the last 21 chapters. And when I heard and saw, I fell down to, there's that word, worship, before the feet of the angel who showed me these things. Then he said to me, see that you do not do that, for I am your fellow servant and of your brethren the prophets and of those who keep the words of this book. Worship God. Worship God. Even in the very end. So you have Cornelius, you have Paul and Barnabas, you have John. Don't do that. Don't sacrifice to us. Don't get on your feet. Don't fall down. Don't worship us. Please, I'm begging you, worship him. Serve him. You remember when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. Matthew chapter 4, we'll get to it. Luke chapter 4. At the end of the 3 temptations, well, what was the third and final temptation of Satan to Jesus in the wilderness, in the desert? He'd been fasting 40 days and 40 nights. Before Jesus began his public ministry, he begins with prayer and fasting. That's a lesson for all of us, by the way. Usually when God's going to do something great and big and special in our lives and blessings around the corner, usually it's preceded with wilderness, desert, dry experiences. Why? Because then when God does do something amazing in our lives and even uses us to bring him glory, he's the one who's going to get the glory. Because we had to go through humbling and wilderness and dryness and then blessings around the corner. That's a lesson. In fact, whenever you study the Bible, study church history, missions history, it was always usually like that. Blessing was always around the corner, but first there was a testing period. There was a trying period. There was a dry spell. And so Jesus is here, and what's the last temptation? Is at the end of a dry spell, Satan says, if you bow down right now, I'm paraphrasing, and you worship me. This is Satan. This is Satan worship. He wants Jesus to become a Satanist, basically. I will give you, and he shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth and all their splendor. He says, I will give you all of this. And what did Jesus say? It is written, you shall worship and serve the Lord your God only. Him only. And with that, Jesus passed the last temptation in the wilderness. So guys, this is always a temptation. We are created to worship. And let me tell you, oh, I'm not worshiping. Let me tell you, even to those who are watching on video, if you're not worshiping Jesus, you're worshiping something or someone. Sometimes we worship self because we are created and designed to worship. And so we're also going to be tempted to worship and venerate people. You know, Catholics, they'll venerate saints. You reach sainthood, and then you can pray to the saints. But even sometimes Christians in the church do the same thing. And that is why some churches are even built on the pastor or the personality of the pastor. And that's why at Calvary Chapel we go through great pains to say, no, worship him. Worship him. Calvary Hawks Bay is and will always be about who? Jesus Christ. He's the good shepherd. It says in Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not what? Want. If I am only your shepherd and like the end and all and be all, you will want, okay? He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me to green pastures. It's because of him my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy provided by him will follow me all the days of my life. Psalm 23 verse 6. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. I will not lack if he is my shepherd. Apostle Peter, what did he write in 1 Peter about being pastors? He said, he who is the chief shepherd. 1 Peter 5:1. He's the senior pastor. He's the lead pastor. He's the shepherd of our souls. He gets the worship. And so that is what it really, really means, guys. As we continue on and we go to Matthew chapter 2, I want you guys to go back now to our text. So it says that they come to the house, they fall down and they worship not Mary, not Joseph, not the star, not an angel. They worship who? Him. Him. Now, circle that word worship. Here's what the word worship means in the Greek. It's proskuneo. It means to kiss the hand of as a token of reverence. Now, you guys know that Greek is better than English. One of the reasons why, because it's so descriptive. But another reason why is Greek gives word pictures. Word pictures. In fact, when the Apostle Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, Philippians 4:13, earlier he uses the word content. He says, I've learned in every state, whether I'm rich or I'm poor, to be content. That word content in the Greek means hand raised. Hand raised. What does that mean? It means I'm fine. It's like after eating a big Thanksgiving meal and you're so stuffed and full, and they said, do you want some dessert, like a slice of pumpkin pie or another piece of turkey? You're like, no, hand raised, I'm full. That's what Paul's saying, content. He says, Jesus has been so good to me, whether I'm rich, it doesn't matter. There's nothing you can add to my life to make it any more richer or happier or joyful. I'm content. Hand raised. Now, the word picture here for worship, to kiss one's hand, is literally like a dog, for you dog lovers, like a dog licking his master's hand. Like a dog licking his master's hand is the word picture for worship in our text this morning. It's literally that adoring, that submissiveness, that just you are the leader. It's your lordship, your leadership. But it's met with great what? Affection. Like a dog licking his master's hand, to kiss someone's hand. You can see why it troubled me when I took the students to Rome as people were weeping and kissing Peter's feet of a statue of Peter, really. It doesn't go there, guys. Worship needs to go to Jesus. And you see, most people believe these could have been Arabians or Babylonians or Persians. I'm tending to believe that these are Persians based on the book of Daniel, because that's where we see magi, that's where we see wise men in the Old Testament. So I personally believe that these are Persian men. But Persians typically would fall upon their knees and touch the ground with their forehead as an expression of profound reverence. So these magi are doing what? They're like kissing the master. They're getting on their, it says that they fell down and what? Worshipped him. So do you have the visual now in your brain? They're on their knees, these Persian magi, and their foreheads to the ground, and they're out of profound, deep reverence and awe and fear of God worshiping Jesus. And now they says, after worship, we're now going to do what? Give you gifts. We're going to wrap it up soon here, but before we move on to the gifts and we close this morning, I want to show you one more thing about worship. One last thing about worship. Go to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 13. Obviously, Hebrews was written to Hebrews with primarily in mind. But in chapter 13, it's the last chapter of the book of Hebrews, and it's all about practical Christianity. It's like, okay, here's all the theology, here's all this doctrine. Hebrews is a very meaty book. Some people don't even like reading Hebrews because they are confused by it. In fact, when I was in Bible college, you didn't take Hebrews class until your last semester before graduation because it's such a hard book to understand and it's so meaty and so deep. But the chapter closes with practical Christianity. And look what it says in Hebrews 13, 15 and 16 in regards to worship. It says, therefore by him let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. But do not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. So guys, giving praise, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks is a sacrifice. Let's be real. Do we always feel like singing to God? No. We're not always in the mood. We don't always feel like worshiping. We don't always feel like, but that's why it's called a sacrifice. And anything sacrificial is what? Costly. But anything costly means what? It has value. So anything that requires sacrifice is costly, and anything that's costly brings value. It's not cheap grace when you think about the cross. Oh, I thought salvation's free. Yeah, it cost you and me nothing, but it cost him everything. Again, it was free, but it doesn't mean it was cheap or that it didn't what? Cost. Crucifixion, the cross, cost Jesus not only pain and suffering, but what? His very life. But what did Jesus say in John 10? No man takes my life away from me, but I what? Lay it down willingly. No man takes my life from me, Jesus said. It wasn't the Romans. It wasn't the Jews. It wasn't the priest. Jesus says, I lay my life down willingly. And what? He says, I have the authority to take it up again. Speaking of the resurrection. So sacrifice is not a bad thing because what? There's cost attached. And if there's cost attached, there's a price tag attached. And if there's a price tag attached, there's value. Okay? So worship cost. It's going to take something of denying self. And that's why we close on this. There's now gifts given. Gifts. One, we see, what's the first gift? Gold. Gold was basically the most precious of metals and the universal symbol of material value and wealth, especially in this world at the time. It's also a symbol of nobility and royalty. So what are they saying? That Jesus is, first and foremost, if you're taking note, he is what?
Royalty.
He is royalty, like what Ron said. So if you're taking note, Jesus is one. If you're taking note, royalty. He's a king. So he's being treated as a what? These magi are giving him gifts with what? Purpose. Okay, not an accident. We're giving you gold, not because we couldn't find anything else lying around the house. We are giving you gold on purpose because this is saying you are royalty, nobility, you are king. Number two, what's the second gift? Frankincense. It's a costly, beautiful smelling incense, was used for special occasions only. It's a certain spice. Now, it was also used for what? That's going to be the next one. But frankincense is also used in the sacrifices in the Old Testament. When they would give an offering, it was like a sweet smelling aroma. So this is what the priest would do. So Jesus is king if you're taking note. But number two, Jesus is also what? He's a priest. He's our great high priest. Hebrews tells us he's our great high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses because he's been tempted in every way yet without sin. See, we've been tempted in every way and found with many sins. He's been tempted in every way yet without sin. It says, let us boldly come before the throne of God to receive grace and mercy in our what? Time of need. So Jesus is a king, but he's also our great high priest. You remember there was the priest in the Old Testament, then there was the high priest. And who was the first high priest ever? Aaron, Moses' brother. See, the high priest was only allowed to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple. And that symbolized and represented what? The presence of God. So the high priest was someone who represented the people of Israel to God, but then he would go back and represent God to the people. See how that works? He would represent the people to God as the high priest, sacrificing in the Holy of Holies in the temple, but then he would represent God to the people. And that's what Jesus does. That's why Jesus called our great high priest. He goes to us representing, I want to know what God the Father's like. Here's Jesus to the people. But then yet, we're not holy enough to go to before God because we have sin. So Jesus says, well, then I'm the high priest, so I'm going to represent people to God. That's why it says in John 14:6, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. So when God looks at you and me, who does he see? Jesus. He says, I'm going to clothe you in my robe of righteousness, which was dipped in my own precious blood. See how that works? See, now you guys are putting things together, Old and New Testament. That's why we need Old Testament as well. It represents people to God, Jesus, the high priest, God to the people. He's the great, what? Mediator. He's the bridge. What's the bridge? The cross. There was a veil. There was a wall between God and me because God's so holy, I'm not. There's this great chasm. Who can cross it? Who's worthy of it? Jesus. So the cross becomes the bridge to join God and man in a happy, holy relationship, not religion. See how that works? So frankincense. And lastly, number 3, myrrh. Myrrh was a perfume mixed with wine, is also an anesthetic. And other spices as a perfume, and it was used in preparation or embalming fluid for burial. So we see that Jesus also was, they also use that as like the death of a prophet. So Jesus was a king, he was a priest, and he was a prophet. Gold, frankincense, Gold, royalty. Frankincense, deity. Myrrh, humanity. So Arabia, Persian, Babylon. Again, these Persian magi coming to worship this Jewish king, but not just king of the Jews, but king of the world. So, as we close this morning, church, in conclusion, they came to worship Jesus and give to Jesus and not get from Jesus. That's an important lesson. Let me say that again. They came to worship and give to Jesus and not get from Jesus. Did you see that in these magi? Sometimes even as Christians we can do that. Well, I'll come to church, or I'll give, or I'll worship, or I'll study, or I'll do this good deed. Because why? I'm hoping to get something from God. I'm hoping to get something from God. And sometimes we have ulterior motives. I'm going to do this and this, so then I scratch your back, God, you scratch my back. But see, these magi didn't do that. They just came to worship and give and not to get. But guess what? You can't outgive God. So if you even come with a pure motive, God's going to give back to you somehow. So that's kind of the cool thing. You can never, ever, ever outgive God. The more you give to Him out of pure and sincere motives, God will still bless and reward and provide and meet, because He is a generous, giving, benevolent God. That's just His nature. That's just who He is. He can't deny Himself. That's His nature. He's a giving God. So when we come worship, church, as we close this morning, we do have one last song. I know we're a bit over, but we started a bit late, to be fair. So that's why we're a bit over. As we close in this last song, I think the song's called How Great Is Our God by Chris Tomlin. Think about His greatness this morning. And maybe you're going through a really, like, Eric, this is like the worst week ever. I've had the worst morning. It's been the worst month, the worst year with COVID. Hey, that may all be true. But something happens to you and me when we get outside of self and we just give the sacrifice of the praise of our lips. You're like, you know what? I actually feel a lot better. I actually feel a lot better. Because if we're too much into self, that's where you get depressed and miserable. God says, I actually want to help you help yourself by getting outside of self. What did Jesus say? He said, if you lose your life for my sake, you'll what? You'll find it. You'll find it. If you lose your life for my sake, you'll actually find it. You'll live the life you were meant to be lived by getting rid of that old life. So if you deny yourself, pick up your cross and follow me daily, you'll actually find a better life that's waiting for you on the other end. Even though I'm asking you to deny yourself, because the world teaches, no, self, be self-centered, be self-absorbed, be selfish, please yourself, live for yourself. And Jesus is the upside down. So, no, if you want to live life really to the fullest, get over yourself. And focus on me, worship me, and then as a result, you then love your neighbor as yourself. So if you love the Lord, the vertical, then all your horizontal relationships will be a lot better, because self is way over here and it's all about the Lord and other people. And that's when you get real joy. And let me just close with that story, guys. Some of my best memories is when I first started out, when I was younger, I would go on a monthly Mexico mission trip. And we'd go help women with build shelters for battered women and children and work at orphanages. And I remember I was with one guy. He was a gangster. He was in one of the biggest gangs in Los Angeles called 18th Street. And he was a new Christian. And he was kind of staring at all these kids. And they were kicking a flat soccer ball around the dirt. Because we were in what they call the colonias, is Spanish for colonies. Like the favelas of Brazil. That's what they were like in Mexico. Like literally their house built out of like garage door material like that. That was like their house. But these kids were Christian kids, and we were serving orphanages, and they were joy in Jesus, and they were laughing and smiling and kicking a flat soccer ball around the mud, and there was dogs going all over the place, and we were serving them that day, and we gave them hot dogs and did a barbecue, and we were in the back of the truck packing up for the day and going back home, back to California. And this gangster was with me named Alex. He has since passed away. But he said, I don't get it. I'm like, what? He's like, look at these kids are in the mud. They're kicking around a flat soccer ball. It doesn't even work. But yet they're so full of joy, so full of contentment and peace. You can see it in their eyes and their faces. And I'm miserable. I'm miserable. I have everything back in California, and I'm just depressed, and I'm miserable. And I said, and then I was able to share with them why those kids had so much joy. and why they were so happy and content. So you see, guys, you'll surprise yourself when you can live off very little. Now, is it I'm saying that we should all live like that? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that some of my best memories have been when I've got over Eric, and I'm like, I'm just going to go to Mexico and serve Jesus and serve these people and remember what life's really all about. Sometimes that's the best cure for depression, is going and just serving someone else in the name of Jesus while we're worshiping Jesus, and then we're serving Jesus by serving people. So that's a little bit to think about this morning. But why don't we all stand?